Kia ora koutou, and thank you for joining us for our International Speaker Series, led by our Commissioner James Renwick with special guest Patricia Mallam. Ko Kate Hansen aho. I'm an advisor in the Communications and Engagement team at the Commission, and I'll shortly explain how the session will run today. But before I do that, I'm going to ask Ben Abraham, Principal Analyst in our Land, Agriculture and Waste team, to lead us into the session with a karakia.
Kia ora Kate, thank you, and tēnā koutou kua huhui mai nei, kia karakia timata tātou, tuia ki runga, tuia ki raro, tuia ki roto, tuia ki waho, ka rongo te pō, ka rongo te ao, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. So that just means unite above, unite below, unite within, unite without. Listen to the night, listen to the world, now come together as one. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Ben, thank you. Before we get started, could you please share your name and the organisation or community you represent into the chat box while I'm talking, and let us know where you're joining us from in the world, so we can see who we've got joining us for these sessions. I also want to let you know that we are recording this session, so anyone who was unable to make it is able to watch it on our website afterwards. We will be making time for a Q&A segment in the second half of this session. You should see a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen where you can type your questions throughout. We might not have a chance to cover all the questions in the session, but we will certainly try to get through as many as we can. To kick things off, I'd like to introduce you to our Commissioner, James Renwick, who will be leading today's session. James is a leading climate scientist with a strong national and international reputation and 4 decades of experience in weather and climate research. His appointment as a lead author and coordinating lead author on 3 assessment reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change demonstrates his expertise. He's also been involved in the governance of the World Climate Research Programme for the past 8 years. He was awarded the 2018 Prime Minister's Prize for Science Communication. With that being said, I'm going to hand over to James to introduce Patricia. Kia ora, James.
Kia ora, Kate. Thank you for that introduction. Not that people came online to hear about me. It's really a great pleasure to be the person who introduces Patricia Mallam to this session. Patricia is someone I've only got to know fairly recently, but a very interesting person, I must say, who's doing really great work in the Pacific. So Patricia is a social scientist, a Fijian social scientist and knowledge broker, specialising in traditional ecological knowledge, disaster risk reduction and science communication. She has proven experience with developing greenpreneurs through public-private partnerships and an advocate for environmental sustainability through education and inclusive community participation in economic development. She says her superpower is harnessing the power of strategic communications to simplify environmental science for behavioural change. Something we could do with a lot more of, I would say. And she currently works as a consultant for development agencies and is a member of the Women's International Network on Disaster Risk Reduction, a fellow of the UN Global Youth Forum, and an accredited community trainer. So welcome again, Patricia. It's really great to have you on this session, and I shall just hand it over to you to lead into your presentation. So kia ora, thank you.
Well, Lavinaka, everyone, and thank you, James, for that introduction. There were moments when I was cringing and I was like, it should be shorter. I don't like hearing too much about myself. So we'll head right into my presentation today. And today I'd like to propose redesigning development for the people at the front line of the climate crisis. And something I'm very passionate about is Indigenous and local knowledge as critical assets for the resilience of Pacific people. So before we head into the short presentation that I'm going to share with you, I just wanted to encourage our participants today across the region in New Zealand to log into Mentimeter. So go to menti.com, and if you could please use the code 8034-7534 to give us feedback on just the 2 questions that I will be asking today, because as I journey through learning about climate change and all of the impacts, there's lots of things that I still need to learn. And today I'm asking 2 critical questions, and I would be so grateful if you could share your responses with us. So the first question that I'm asking you today is, what is climate change in your Indigenous language? And this is what you should see when you go on Mentimeter. Wait a second. So I'm interested to hear from you on what the word or phrase for climate change is in your Indigenous language. And I also acknowledge that for a lot of us, it would be in English, but if you have climate change translated into a local or Indigenous language, please share that with us. This poll will be open for the duration of my presentation, so feel free to add additional comments in here and we can circle back at the end of the session. Okay, thank you. So we'll head right into the presentation, and I'd like to start with what we know and what we've been taught about development. I wanted to share a little story about when I was a student at university and I was studying development theory. And constantly in a lot of the units that I studied, you know, there were presentations of theories of development, and which I now reflect upon and realize that they were all Western theories of development. The four main theories that I was taught were related to modernization, dependency, world systems, and globalization. And I question these theories a lot, especially the modernization theory. And to some degree, I still do question when I say, you know, what do we mean by modernization? Having grown up in the Pacific and studying traditional systems simultaneous to modernization theory, you know, I learned that a lot of the things that we do still work and they sustain communities and they have been for decades, but then why are we abandoning these practices for Western theories? And there was this one time I remember in a tutorial when I presented a question to my tutor and she turned to me and she said, you know, you're going to fail this course if you keep asking questions like that. You need to stick with what's in the book and you need to respond accordingly in the exams. And I got quite upset to the point where I took it up with the head of school. I'm glad to share that I did not fail that class. And I don't know where the tutor is now, but I hope that, you know, for the sake of development in the Pacific, we are beginning to question and not just take what's being given to us. Next slide, please. I'd like to focus more closely on Rusto's modernization theory, which was the one that gave me the most grief, and it still does. God forbid anyone is still using this as a measure of progress, because in my opinion, I think this is why we're facing the problems we are facing now. So the assumptions, the main assumptions of Rusto's modernization theory is that it's a systematic process. And the attribute of modernity forms a consistent whole and it appears in a cluster rather than in isolation. The other thing is that it's a transformative process. And in order for society to move into modernity, we need to abandon traditional structures and the values need to be totally replaced with modern values. I can feel already a few people, you know, like nodding or frowning to this. And lastly, the other aspect of the modernization theory, which I did not agree with at all, is that it is an imminent process due to its systemic and transformative nature, which builds change into the social system. This is something that we're not seeing, despite it being a measure for modernization or development over the last few years. Next slide, please. All right, so now I'm going to simplify it a lot more and in the context of climate action. So where are we now when we talk about development, when we talk about the climate crisis, and what has happened ever since the world became aware of the climate crisis? So there are four main things that I wanted to share with you in terms of learning: education and strike. So when we realized that the climate crisis was something that we need to worry about, we followed, and when I say we, I mean we here in the Pacific, we here in Fiji, we followed the Western world when they decided to strike and children stopped going to school. You know, that got the world's attention, and I wholeheartedly commend Greta and the strikers around the planet. But for the global South, where education is a privilege, I could see the dilemma among the youth strikers in the Pacific that I worked with, because they want to continue education. They want to progress their standing to be able to lobby internationally for their disappearing islands. But to do so, they need to be in school. They simply cannot afford to be out on the streets holding placards with a threat of being arrested or even tarnishing their entire careers before it started. The second thing is technical and digital changes. We've seen the revolution all over the world, but we're not seeing any behavioral change. You know, we managed to advance electric vehicles. We're planning to go to other planets, and we've developed all sorts of smart devices, but we have not been able to change behaviors, simple things like carpooling and opting out of unhealthy or carbon unfriendly behaviors. We're not changing mindsets about being sustainable, and sustainability is so expensive. Thirdly, we're presenting cases in international forums, but we're lacking the political will and the action. So we successfully pushed for the ocean agenda, and it is now part of the COP process. And we are now pushing for success in the International Court of Justice, such as the case of Vanuatu. But my question again is, why is it taking so long for these decisions to be made? And lastly, Indigenous and community representation within formal spaces. I think that's great. You know, I really admire and I really look up to Indigenous community representatives who go to these formal COP spaces. But then in the back of my mind, I'm like, is anyone really listening to them? Or are they just, you know, fantasizing or continuously sensationalizing their plight? Are we tokenizing our representatives just to tick the development box? Next slide, please. So I'd like to again invite you to go to Mentimeter and please respond to the next question that I have, which is on, so my next question is, are there any climate relocation initiatives or projects underway in your country? And this is something that I think is rather shocking, because it seems like there are a lot of relocation initiatives. It's shocking, and I think it's very sad to say, because does this mean that we have given up the fight and we really don't have a choice but to start moving our people? Thank you for participating in the poll. I'm going to just go back to the slides now. Okay, so when it comes to climate change relocation, one of the questions that I've been pondering on for a while now is, have we conceded to the climate crisis? In the case of Fiji, we're seeing more intense and frequent natural hazards. We've been struck by 13 disasters with an approximate damage of more than 3 billion and 79 deaths since 2016. Those figures are quite alarming. In Fiji, we've already earmarked 40 communities for relocation due to sea level rise, saltwater intrusion, and other water-related hazards. And in 2020, sad to say, I mean, it might be seen as a success, but we've had to establish the Climate Relocation and Displaced People's Trust Fund for communities and infrastructure. It became the world's first relocation fund for people displaced by climate change. I know that New Zealand contributed 2 million in funding to put towards the relocation of Fijian communities displaced by climate change. And while that's commendable, I think it's also very sad, because whilst Fiji's guidelines do acknowledge the importance of culture and heritage, I personally feel that relocation should be the last resort. And if that's something that we're already arriving at now, the future does look rather bleak. Next slide, please. So collectively, I'd like for us to consider a few questions when we unpack climate change relocation. So when we talk about climate change relocation, like what are the indicators of successful relocation? I know we have relocation guidelines that have been published, but do they actually consider what success looks like holistically? Have we considered adaptation in the emotional and cultural sense? It's easy to relocate communities physically, relocate infrastructure, but how do we adapt emotionally and culturally to relocation? And one of the most important questions that a lot of social scientists ask is relocation community-led? And I think we can have the best relocation guidelines, but unless they are practical and continually reviewed and revised, they will just be another publication that got launched at a COP and is currently shelved. Next slide, please. I'd like to now touch on challenges for Indigenous participation in climate resilience activities. So first, one of the most pressing issues I feel is the lack of recognition of Indigenous and local knowledge. It is so easy for people to publicize emerging Indigenous and local knowledge, but I think the recognition that it does, in fact, I think it does kind of meet the science in a certain level, especially when you consider things like early warning systems, understanding the pattern of nature, birds, as well as the indicators around us in terms of preparedness and planning. I think there's not enough recognition given to the value of knowledge systems, and there's more value being given to science, which is fair, but I do feel that there is a place where they can meet and inform better risk planning. The second thing is that climate change is a very foreign and technical. It might be in English, but how do we engage Indigenous participation in these activities when the language is not one of their own? And for this reason, I asked earlier in the Mentimeter poll, what is climate change in your own language, if there even is a phrase or a couple of words to describe it? Thirdly, the complexity of the climate change negotiation process. That seems to be something that is, that kind of closes the door on Indigenous communities. And there is a certain level of diplomacy required to engage in this process. But how can you be diplomatic when your survival is being threatened? The next point is the access to climate finance requires capacity and skills which usually exist outside the local community. And this is where it's so important to begin to bolster our local capacity so that we're localizing a lot of the engagement at not just the international level, but even on the national level. And this leads nicely into the next point, is that our education systems have not evolved to incorporate Indigenous participation. Just recently, I had a conversation with an academic who was working on designing climate change curriculum. And it's interesting because in the Pacific, it's only recent that a lot of students have access to causes that are specific to climate change. And now when the rest of the world is already engaged in conversations about carbon trading or climate finance, we're still here in the initial stages of educating our students on what climate change is. So there's a huge gap in education systems. And lastly, the perceptions of Indigenous people. A lot of times in the formal climate change spaces where a lot of the big decisions are made, Indigenous people are seen as the ones that add color. And one of my not so nice experiences was attending a side event at a conference. And in the lead up to that, one of the most offensive things I heard was, can you make sure that they bring the colorful outfits and bring the group that wears the headgear? And the discussion then ensued to be like, oh, but that's not traditionally theirs. And it's like, no, but we still like them to bring the color to this event, and just ask them if they can put this on, even though traditionally it was not theirs. So we really need to look at the challenges, not just, you know, institutional challenges, but the kind of offensive things that happen in this space, which inhibit the participation of Indigenous communities. Next slide, please. And in closing, I would like for us to consider, you know, when it comes back to the theories of development, I'd like to propose that we think of the opportunities for the Pacific to propose solutions, and really flip the development models on its head, and to think that offering solutions can be community-led. They can be grounded in Indigenous local knowledge systems, but with protective measures. And I think what we need to do is that we need to be more holistic with our thinking, so that we're not creating more problems while we're designing solutions. Theoretically, at least I think 1.5 is still alive after the negotiations, and this is all good, but it isn't enough. I don't think we're acting with enough urgency, and in relation to how the entire planet mobilized for action during the pandemic, I think we're still too slow. We managed to develop vaccines, we managed to rapidly vaccinate entire countries and close borders, but why are we still stalling on climate action? And it doesn't mean taking climate action on the street, because even though it matters, in countries where it is possible, the evidence shows that people are deeply influenced by those around us, what we see them doing, the conversations we have in our lives. Public consent and public pressure go together in driving politicians to make change. And the change we make, the change that we ask for in our communities, even down to conversations we have at the dinner table, they all need to be part of that story. So in short, I think a whole society or meaningful engagement is needed to deliver this social change that will stir politicians to deliver better and stronger pledges. And now in 2022, I think it matters ever before for us to redesign development for people of the Pacific. And if it means flipping the theories, I think we must. Thank you, James. Back to you.
Wow, thank you so much, Patricia. That was great stuff, and yeah, quite confronting stuff in a lot of ways. I was thinking as you were talking, boy, the effects of colonialism, right? And this all talk about, you know, development theory, about, you know, modernization and so on, and what does that mean? And yeah, it's shocking, really. One of the things you said that really struck me was you're talking about the processes that communities need to go through, and you said something like sustainability, it's so expensive, and I thought, boy, doesn't that tell you that we're doing things the wrong way? If being sustainable is expensive, it should be what happens, right? So yeah, I have written down a lot of questions I'd love to ask. Maybe I'll start off just with talking about, you know, you mentioned that there are, I think, 40 or so communities in Fiji that are earmarked for relocation. And you talked about relocation and is it community-led and so on. I wondered if you had any sense of how those communities affected are, you know, how are they responding? How is the communication being handled? Is it being handled? Well, what's actually going on there?
I think, James, it depends on who you talk to. If you speak to the project manager who was in charge of designing and leading on the relocation, they will tell you it was successful and it was great. They moved 30 or odd people from an area that was considered high risk to a safer area, and they're able to survive. But it's not just about survival, is it? I think people need to be given the dignity. People need to retain some form of dignity regardless of where they are physically. And over time, and I'm sure there's science to back this up, over time, the emotional trauma will supersede that physical comfort that you get from having moved from one place to another. So I have I have spoken to a few members of communities that have been relocated. It's actually part of a research project that I'm working on. And it is sad to say that, you know, what's commonly perceived as success is not necessarily success for members of the community.
Yes, right, and thanks for that. I'm not too surprised to hear you say that. Yeah, it's really striking to know that this is happening. I mean, I knew that it was a big issue, but I hadn't actually heard from anyone yet that yes, there are communities that are definitely having to move. Yeah, that's quite sobering. And I think you're right. The emotional impacts of that kind of thing are probably harder to deal with in a way than the physical impacts ultimately. Anyway, look, another question that's come up in the chat, that's parallels one I had written down about climate finance, really, and it is, how can we reconcile the need for community-led adaptation and incorporation of local knowledge with the bureaucratic requirements of international funders? So how do those worlds mesh together better? Did you catch that?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
In my opinion, I think this boils down to authentic consultations and conversation. And I will allude to a very recent experience where one of the development partners recently put out a call for some work to be done around understanding or putting in place a framework for Indigenous knowledge systems. And when, you know, like when that conversation progressed, it was amusing to see that they had already pegged a budget and a process to it, as opposed to leaving it open to understand the process before putting a figure to it based on what the need was. So I think a lot of times there's this whole top-down approach. And I think if you really want to be inclusive and you really want to address the social problems that are coming out of relocation, you can't come with a budget and say, this is what we've got to do this work, because you can't quantify culture. And you can't come in with a limited checkbook to try and put an economic value to people's lives.
Indeed, yeah. It's another one of those hard situations, I think. And I wonder what the best model is for that. I know it is bureaucratic. It's hard to get at this climate funding if it exists in the first place. And there's a lot of hoops to jump through and so on. Maybe that's the way it has to be. I don't know. And look, people on the call, people listening, do write questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Anyway, look, we'll carry on. The next question I've got here is, do you see opportunities for New Zealand to work with its large Pacifica communities to improve its climate support and solidarity in the Pacific? So that's working with Pacifica communities in New Zealand. Can that be used to improve support across the Pacific?
Well, in essence, I would just like to say that, you know, I acknowledge that New Zealand considers itself a Pacific Island country to begin with. It is part of Pacifica, and it is home to a lot of Pacific Islanders. And I know from some of the latest statistics that in the forecast from 2019 to 2022, New Zealand has committed more than 500 million in climate-related support through its official development assistance program. And it has also committed more than 300 million. And I think, you know, having that level of support that doesn't just kind of clearly demarcate us and you is the first approach in trying to understand the people of the Pacific. And when it comes to the context of climate-induced migration, I also like to commend the New Zealand Defence Report, which predicted the climate-driven security impacts, and that you are already looking at, you know, accommodating possibly Pacific Islanders that may have to relocate over a period of years. It just showcases their traditional humanitarian role in the Pacific. And I think building upon the commitments they have already made, there is a potential for even better relationships, which are not just based on trade or transactions.
Right. Right. Thanks. Yeah, and that's another important point of how we respond to climate change. If we can do it in a way that reduces inequalities that have existed for a long time, then that's, that makes a better world, socially as well as physically, hopefully. And another question that's just come in that's sort of related to that, which is interesting. How important do you think it is to have a focus on gender when considering climate relocation?
I think it's absolutely important. And this is something quite interesting. And this is something I learned just yesterday, because we were talking about disaster risk reduction and vulnerable groups within the space of climate relocation, climate change disasters. And someone mentioned that, the most vulnerable groups are women. And someone else argued and said, I don't think we should continue to see women as vulnerable groups. They might be vulnerable in the physical sense, but when you think of post-disaster recovery and responsiveness, women are the most rapid, women are the most fluid to respond to or recover from. They're the planners, they are the ones who immediately get the houses in order. And instead of looking at them, looking at women or like just gender, them as the weaker gender, we could really look at strengthening them to continue to play these critical roles or even step up and take the lead in positions of authority when it comes to planning.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it reminds me that we need to be very careful about language. You've got some technologist, scientist flies into your country and tells you, oh, you're a vulnerable community. It's pretty disempowering, I would say, when actually these are really resilient communities. So yeah, we need to be thinking about how our words land and how we appear to the people receiving the information. But anyway, another question, if relocation is not favoured, and you mentioned that you talked about, do we not have any choice? Are we giving in to climate change? And I think, yeah, that's an interesting point. But the reality is the climate has already changed. The sea levels have already risen. We have to respond to that. So we have to have a certain amount of adaptation. And, this government in this country has just put out its first adaptation plan here. But we also need to get on top and, stop it getting any worse. But anyway, assuming relocation has to happen, but if it's not favoured, but climate destabilisation is pressing with ocean sea level rise and other effects, what are some of the things we could do before relocation? That is, what other ways do we have to adapt to these situations beyond relocating communities?
I think conditioning is important, and being able to have really open and honest conversations, which can help us discover solutions that might not have been thought of. And this is something I think we need to begin to verbalize more, is that leadership is not, authority is not leadership. And sometimes the people in positions of authority are not necessarily the ones who have all the solutions. It's okay to ask questions, and it's okay to learn from those around you. And in saying that, I think to prime communities up to relocation, if that is the last resort, and it seems like it is for a lot of the small island countries, there needs to be a level of transparency and openness in taking them on that journey to relocation. And it's not about putting people on planes or boats and just shipping them off. It's about working with them, maybe 5-10 years before it happens, to inform them of the process that's going on, what to expect, what not to, what to expect, what not to look forward to or expect so much, because in the end, there's a lot of uncertainty around relocation.
Sure.
And sorry, James, I just wanted to add, like, one of the more critical components of relocation has to be the psychological support that people get, because in the Pacific, a lot of people have very close links to their traditional cultures, their land, and their sense of being is very tied to where they are at this moment in time. And if you're expecting people to leave all of that behind, there needs to be a very robust process in enabling that kind of that detachment from what they've always known.
Yes, exactly. And it must be very disorienting to think about portable sovereignty, taking the notion of your land, your country, and moving it somewhere else. You know, it's somewhere else. It's not the same, even if you're calling it home now. So it's, yeah, pretty hard for people to deal with, I would think. Yeah. Another question that's come in that's very interesting, changing tack a little bit. Have you seen any good examples of Indigenous peoples from different parts of the world collaborating on culturally grounded climate adaptation solutions?
Oh, wow, that's a pretty deep one because I don't know enough about the rest of the world. I can, however, you know, I can consider some examples from my part of the world, which is in the Pacific region, but I don't have enough access to case studies of good examples from around the world. And I think some of the more common ones, I would say in Fiji at least, where you have communities opting for more traditional systems of safeguarding coastlines, preferring to use agricultural methods that are more sustainable. And I know this might seem a little bit fluffy, but I think that any effort that's made to reduce emissions should be respected anyway. And there's this whole argument that, you know, we are not the biggest emitters and we're the ones facing the brunt of it. But there's still a lot of initiatives to reduce emissions that are rampant in local communities here. And I'm seeing a lot more communities opting and reverting to traditional agricultural methods, the use of preservation methods, and using Indigenous knowledge systems for early warning signs to adapt to impending disasters. I hope that answers your question, but I really like that question. And I think this gives me, you know, that's giving me something else to think about in terms of what else is happening outside of the Pacific. Are you aware of any case studies yourself?
Somewhat, not directly, but I am aware that there are Maori research groups, Maori communities in New Zealand who have links to Native American communities on the west coast of North America and the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia. And there's been an exchange of ideas, at least as far as I know, and maybe if anyone who's on the call can fill us out, I'd be interested to hear more. But also a group I've worked with at NIWA in Auckland have links to Indigenous communities in Scandinavia and Finland, the Sami people, and this again research linkages between what's happening with climate change in the Arctic Circle and how Indigenous people are responding to that and the lessons they can learn from Maori in New Zealand, which is a really interesting crossover, you know, very different climates in very different parts of the world, but there's a lot of similarities to the way that people are approaching things. And I think it comes back to what you were saying earlier on about, you know, traditional knowledge. It's not something you take out of a book on the shelf. It's a whole way of looking at the world and how you respond to these issues. And I'll just
I can just add,
yeah, go on.
There's one, I mean, like one, not a case study, but one of the more common things I am hearing now, which is coming up more frequently, is around the design of infrastructure. So in the context of Fiji and one of the communities in the north, on Yandua Island, they were devastated by Tropical Cyclone Evan a few years ago. And when I visited that community, I got to see some photographs of what the community coastline looked like 10 years before it was hit and the present day. And what was alarming was 10 years before, they had these huge bures, or traditional buildings that were used as homes. And then in the present day, they had a lot more modern homes, which were also constructed alongside these traditional homes. But the amusing thing to note was that after Cyclone Evan, the only buildings that were left standing were the bures, the traditional buildings. And when I've had conversations after that with architects and people in the engineering profession, a lot of them are saying that climate resilient infrastructures are based on the traditional Fijian model of building homes with the high roofs, with the strong beams, which allow airflow as well as accommodate for really strong winds. And I think in responding to the question that was asked earlier, from my experience and my knowledge, that would have to be one of the examples of Indigenous knowledge being used as a response to adapt to climate impacts.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great point. And the Indigenous building design didn't happen by accident. It's come about because people know what the risks are, what the climate's like. So that's no surprise. And this one of the participants has put into the chat, and I think this is happening in other countries too, but he's saying in the Western US, there's a big push to incorporate Indigenous practices of intentional fire starting to thin forests and reduce wildfire risk from climate change. So you help fires, burn naturally, as it were, and that reduces the risk overall. And I'm not sure if that's happening in Australia, but it's certainly something that I think was practiced by Aboriginal communities too. So yeah, I'm sure there are a lot of opportunities there. Just before these questions disappear off my screen, there are a lot of Indigenous communities in this country, a lot of Maori communities around the country that are, and a lot of Pacific communities in Aotearoa that are vulnerable to climate change. And I wondered whether, given your experiences in Fiji, whether you had any thoughts on how in this country we could take a thoughtful and inclusive approach to responses and adaptation with those communities here in New Zealand.
Well, I don't have enough experience in understanding what is happening in the space, in New Zealand, but one of the things I think that would also be very applicable to Fiji would be safeguarding practices. But I think even before getting to safeguarding, we need to at least acknowledge that Indigenous communities and Indigenous knowledge systems have a very critical role to play when it comes to designing development. And if there is a way for us to establish standards or frameworks for integrating Indigenous knowledge holders and systems into the planning process, then it allows for a proper conversation around, do we design a policy to safeguard these things? Because from what I know, Indigenous knowledge systems are not open to everyone. It's not something that is available for public consumption, and it does require a certain level of protection. Right.
But it's something that should be brought in as part of the whole process at the beginning. It's not, you don't tack on a bit of Indigenous knowledge once you've finished writing your report, sort of thing. You've got to have it in at the ground level, right? And I couldn't agree more with that.
That's right. And I think in the beginning, it needs to at least be acknowledged. Like, while we value science-based evidence and climate science, there's also value in at least understanding, or, as I mentioned earlier, it is worth understanding traditional knowledge systems and where the science backs it up to validate that process. And I know we have a lot of traditional scientists in our communities. They may not have had formal education, but I tell you, they can predict the weather better than the Met Office can.
Better than I can, probably. I'm sure you're right. And again, that's another aspect of colonialism, or the Western view of the world, I suppose. You might say, if you've gone to a certain university and got a piece of paper, then you're somehow officially knowledgeable. if you haven't, forget about it. Well, that's not necessarily good thinking. Hey, another question that I've got here that's again is interesting and broad. What's your thinking around the intersection of climate or climate change response with other issues such as gender and biodiversity and human rights, sort of, and the whole spectrum of the social issues that we have across the world, I guess. Very broad question.
Well, I break it down to two things really. Like in my thinking, climate change impacts biodiversity completely on a different level, but it also impacts humans. And there comes a time when people say, like, what do we need to protect? And this is a question that I'm asked often when I used to do a lot more conservation work. It's like, do we protect nature and then humans and then impede the development of human beings, or how does it work? Do we all become tree huggers and like radical environmentalists? At the end of the day, we must understand that humans need to progress, but we don't need to, it doesn't need to cost us the earth to do that. And it comes down to being conscious. And I feel that even on an individual level, if humans are able to be conscious about what they need in order to develop or to progress, it then is reflected in the actions that are taken at a communal level and then on a national level. And it all comes down to just you as an individual identifying what your needs are in order to live not too comfortably and not at the cost of those or the planet around you. And in saying this, I think we can't put one or the other if we're thinking about being practical, because a lot of times it comes down to compromising, but knowing what's at stake is also very important. And the social change, like the social impacts of the actions you take are going to be there regardless of, whether you put the planet first or whether you put people first. The social impacts are going to roll out based on the decision that you make. And this is where I'm like really strongly advocating for individual consciousness and individual action, so that when you engage in communal spaces, how you behave on an individual level can have an impact on how your community engages on a more national level.
Right, thanks. Another question's come in, which I don't know if you'll have a response to this, but again, it's an interesting question. It's asking what advice and insights can be gained from the experience of the people of Rongelap in the Marshall Islands, who were moved with the help of Greenpeace away from their contaminated homeland after the nuclear tests that were conducted in the 1960s and so on, which were happening very close to where they lived. So Greenpeace helped them to relocate. And I don't know whether you're familiar with the story, but do you have any insights about that process and how it could reflect on climate change related relocation?
Thanks. That's a good question, but I prefer usually not to comment on the actions that other Pacific Islands have made to sustain communities or to survive. But one thing that I can say is that there's a lot to learn from that process itself, and we shouldn't just rely on the reports that were published by like I said, the project managers or the institution that led the relocation.
Right.
It is entirely on us, if we are desperately keen to understand the failings and the success of the relocation, to engage with those who were relocated. It's a different story to talk to the people who talk about the relocation or who planned it, but it's an entirely different story to actually talk to people who were affected by the relocation. And this is something that I base on my firsthand experience with relocated communities in Fiji.
Yeah, great response. Hey, and one more question has just come in. Thanks very much, Kate. And I think it's a very interesting one relating to Fiji and sort of the political makeup of the country. And the question is, what role do traditional leaders play in Fiji for planning adaptation compared to the national government? So what's the interaction between the government and traditional leaders in the community in Fiji?
Well, I'm not sure if people know, but over the last few years, we've seen a slight restructure in how administration is done, even all the way down to the village level. So you have, the chief, a village chief, and then you also have a government appointed representative in the village. So a lot of the planning is done with the government representative, as well as the traditional kind of headman of the village. And then the process, from what I understand, is then channeled through the provincial administrator and then to the commissioner of the division. In Fiji, we have 14 provinces, and then within those provinces, you have multiple villages, and then each of the village will have a representative.
Okay.
Yeah,
oh,
it is a little bit more structured, and we're able to see a lot more things progress for the benefit of rural communities who may have struggled in the past. And at the end of the day, I think as long as the systems are working and incorporate the traditional mechanisms of community management, that's a good thing. But it should also be able to hold the whole system to account, where individuals should be able to question the system and say, I'm not so happy with this. Can I have an opportunity to propose something else? Right.
Indeed, yeah. Oh, that's really interesting to hear. It sounds good. Okay, I think that might be enough with the questions, and I'm curious to know, I think we're all curious to know what the responses to your menti.com questions were. Are you able to share that with us now? I'm not sure how that's going to work, but what
if you
what
give
did
me
you get?
Minute.
Yep, sure.
All right. Hang on a second. There's 1 and 2. Wow, I think the second one is quite alarming. I don't like the second one.
Okay. Guess you're not bound to show us if you really don't want to.
No, so so interesting. What is the word or phrase for climate change in your Indigenous language? And wow, okay. It seems like climate change is the more common one. And I wonder if there are other Pacific Island communities who have developed a glossary or additional definitions of things related to climate change. And let me show you the second one, which I said was one I didn't want to look at. This is not a nice one. Are there any climate relocation initiatives or projects underway in your country?
Wow.
And I have a feeling that this is something that we're going to see more and more of. The numbers are going to climb steadily.
I'm sure you're right, certainly.
And this is why we need to begin, thinking of ways to make relocation a lot more effective and really look at what does it mean to be successful.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. It's been talked about as a principle for a long time, but really getting down to how it's done and how we really protect communities as it is done is a hard thing to grapple with, but something we have to address very urgently, I'd say. Okay, well, look, thank you again, Patricia. It's been absolutely fascinating. And I think I'll hand back to Kate just to wrap up the session. We're nearly at 1 o'clock. So thank you, and over to you, Kate.
Kia ora, James. Thank you for that. And a huge thank you to you, Patricia. That was a hugely valued kōrero. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else watching learned heaps too. And we got some great conversation coming in through the chat. So all in all, an awesome session. Thank you. I'm now going to hand back over to Ben to close the session with a karakia.
Thanks very much, Kate. And just to second those thanks to you, Patricia, real privilege to have you with us and to learn from all of your wisdom. So thank you very, very much for joining us. And thanks to everyone joining today as well, and for the great questions that came through. So thanks to everyone who asked those too. Kia karakia whakamutunga tēnei, poi poe te Māori, poi poe te Wairua, poi poe te Tapu, poi poe te whenua o Papa Tuanuku. So that just means nurture the life force, nurture the spirit, nurture the sacredness, nurture the lands of Mother Earth. Kia ora koutou.